There you go. All right. Just to start off, Kendall, thank you so much for all of your hard work and your dedication to LADAMS. I personally want to thank you for the incredible work and guidance that you provided us for, starting our DEI, our diversity, equity and inclusion program. I really want to thank you for that. Without you, this would not have been possible. So thanks so much. With that said, I do want to introduce our speaker today. Joining us today is an amazing visionary and true champion of diversity and inclusion. If you've maybe seen her on TV, you see her, you're gonna think, oh, well, I definitely know her. She's been on CNN, on NBC, she's been on PBS. Her leadership programs and the campaigns that she started have spanned over 5 continents, nearly all 50 states. She's a published author, and she is now new founder and CEO of Better at Work. So without further ado, because I know we're running short on time, I'm going to turn it over to Marjorie Clifton. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have to tell you, sitting on this call, I'm kind of overwhelmed by the amazing camaraderie, and especially existing in one of my favorite spaces, which is food. And so I'm feeling just honestly envious of the incredible network that you guys have. And I'll tell you, one of the interesting things about the D&I space, actually just this week was giving a talk to a company and their employee resource group around women is just, as a gender, the amazing ways that I think women connect in such vulnerable and heartfelt ways. And so I just want to tell you, I'm touched and heartened by what cheerleaders you guys clearly are for each other. And that's such a gift. Gosh, there's so much to cover. And so what I wanted to do, something has happened. Are y'all hearing me?
We can hear you, Marjorie.
Okay. So all of a sudden, like when it went off of Lorena, I lost my visual on you guys. So I can't see anyone, but I was going to try to find the chat. I'm going to talk for just a little bit, but then what I'd really like to do is hear from all of you, because I want to make sure I'm answering and speaking to what you need to hear and what you want to hear. Just to kind of help you understand sort of how I came into this space, and working in diversity and inclusion is really hard because no one person represents all aspects of diversity and inclusion. As a white woman, I came into it really because I started my career working in technology in Austin, Texas, which was a very lonely place to be as a woman at the time that I was doing it. I was the only female in every room I went into. And really, my work in this space was born out of my own experiences. And so I spent about 10 years in Washington, D.C., and it was interesting because I was working in so many different kinds of industries, focusing on how organizations communicated. So I was working around messaging, which meant sometimes building campaigns. Sometimes it was helping businesses work on policy-related issues. But what I started to see were the themes were very much the same. First of all, I kind of laugh about this, but I was constantly pulled to deal with anyone who was not basically an old white guy in every setting. So I was like, really? I represent all of diversity and inclusion just for being a woman in these fields, which is laughable because it's not true, but it took me on a journey which very much became about trying to understand where, at a time where there really weren't D&I initiatives happening in companies. And so what we did within my organization is, in addition to the communications work we were doing, I did a lot of work focused on specifically getting women into leadership of companies. And with that, looking at organizations and how they dealt with diversity lenses and how they became more inclusive organizations. Now, obviously, this is like the hottest issue happening everywhere. I'll tell you the good and the bad of it. The good is that people are talking about it, that there's an awareness of. The bad is that I still see the same challenges that I saw when I entered the space, which was a lot of just sort of token check the box kind of work. And a little bit, in some cases, it was an inoculation against, I don't want to be guilty of, being that organization, that person who's bad because they're not inclusive. And so, I had had organizations contact me saying, hey, we really want to understand how we can do this work better, how we can be more inclusive. And we would do these audits and look at the organization and help understand where employees were coming from. And at the end, they would look at the assessment and go, wow, this looks really expensive and really hard to change what we're doing. Can you just do a training or some promotional material talking about how awesome we are in diversity. And that's kind of been the hard part. And I think some of that's still true. So, I kind of want to enter the conversation acknowledging first that we are not born as human beings. And this is kind of into that implicit bias space. And I think that's a really comfortable place for a lot of organizations to enter these conversations, which is that as human beings, we naturally gravitate towards people like us. And that's because it's comfortable. It's whether it's how we grew up, whether it's related to gender. I mean, there are some really amazing things that are happening on this call with a group of women that I don't think we would see with a group of like male food, business owners and chefs. And it's a really magical thing. But some of that happens with the familiarity and frankly, an understanding of the manners and the norms that happen within specific groups. And I'll give you another example of this. I lived in London for about 3 years after I had graduated from college, and I was a UT grad, and so they had a Texas Exes Alumni Association there. And by the way, there were like 8,000 members of the Texas Exes in London, but we would have these gatherings where we'd actually get together in a barbecue joint, which was like some guy from North Carolina who'd started a barbecue joint in London, and to get to watch the football games. And you would have thought that every person in that room had known each other since birth and we were best friends. None of us knew each other. But having that affinity and that connection of having gone to the University of Texas and being an American in the middle of London was this sort of unique connection point. And so it's very normal and very human to be looking for those connections and to be drawn to. And so a lot of this means we got to sort of step outside of just what our familiar worlds are. And it's really about thinking of other people's experiences. And I'm seeing a lot of companies right now investing in empathy training, in understanding, which is that exercise of sort of understanding other people's experiences, which is true of how we manage staff and how we hire as well. So one of the things I would just invite you all to think about as a starting point is, as business owners, how diversity and inclusion, what does that look like? And that can be everything from the pool of people you hire from and who are those networks, because usually they're networks coming from familiar places that we know. They might be, out of other affinity groups that you're involved in. They may be from other places you've lived. They may be from a school. If you studied at the Cordon Bleu, that may be a huge network of people that that you can hire from. And sometimes it may be just hiring from other restaurants, right? So you're kind of sharing some of the same people that get passed around in town in the business. But with that question becomes, am I hiring to a very specific skill set, a very specific set of experiences that may or may not be the best person for that job? And so let me give you one other example. I was working with one of the big 5 consulting companies, and they were trying to think about how do we diversify our pool of employees that we're hiring? Well, I looked at it, and all of their recruiting was specifically focused out of business schools at about 10 different schools. So they were all like MBAs or business school hires. And I asked them, I said, well, what is really the most important skill set that you're hiring for in this role, in this sort of starter role as a consultant? And they were like, oh, well, it's 100% communications. And I'm like, okay, so communications is the key skill set, but you are only hiring out of the business school. And what does the diversity metrics of these schools that you're hiring from look like? And it was a pretty homogenous group out of all 10 of those schools. And so, sort of the first challenge to them was, well, if this is what your goal is in terms of diversity, then you've got to change some habits. And it means that you've got to be a little bit more deliberate in terms of how you look for your team members and who you're looking for. But I would even take it a step beyond that. And so I've done audits for organizations globally and domestically, but in lots of different industries. But one of the things that sometimes we look at is just our own pool of employees. But what we forget about is like how much power that even just by the way, this entire collective have in terms of buying power, as in terms of vendors that you end up working with. And so another step to kind of look at is, who am I sourcing product from? And what does their diversity metrics look like? And that is actually a lever that and I would say even in the past 3 months, I've helped a few organizations very powerfully think about how they had sort of disrupt industry by saying, how can we use our collective power to demand certain diversity metrics, let's say, or different kinds of, and diversity, by the way, isn't just about gender. It isn't just about skin color. It is also educational experience. It is cultural, it is religious, it is socioeconomic. And those are all very important things to sort of unpack and look at because they represent different perspectives. Because really at the end of the day, when I'm trying to get organizations to buy into this idea of why am I doing this other than a fear of being shamed, right? Or being cool or it being marketing, is that are you genuinely bought into the idea if I bring in lots of different perspectives, my business will thrive? And part of that may be because I serve lots of different kinds of people and perspectives. Part of that may be because organizations are more innovative and we have data out the wazoo that says that. I'm a far better innovator when I've got lots of different ways of thinking about a problem or solving a business challenge. And with that, what does that mean? And so there's a reason that also in these acronyms you see the word inclusion, because diversity alone is not really enough when it comes to making this effective. Because what happens in organizations that say, we just want to focus on making sure we have diversity, is that they may hire in those employees who may look different and be from different backgrounds. But if they don't fit the culture, or if they don't feel like they are truly included in everything down to, the after work happy hour and cocktails, or they feel like they're uncomfortable in the way that people are talking, let's say politics, which is on my mind a lot right now, but talking politics, at work, if that is happening in a way that makes them feel othered, then typically those people leave because they feel uncomfortable or they don't feel understood or they don't feel appreciated. So that's what that inclusion term you're hearing a lot about has to do with. There was a woman, and I'm blanking on the book name right now, but a woman that I was working with at one point who had been very involved in dealing with the farm workers in California and had pulled together to focus on the sourcing. There was a lot of abuse of women that were happening. And so essentially by pulling together a collective in the food industry, and I can follow up with the story on this in her book, but essentially they powerfully changed industry standards around how they were treating largely immigrant workers in California. And I spent a lot of time, by the way, working on immigration policy. So this was something I cared a lot about. And it's something that I actually see, especially in the food industry, as a really big challenge. I know as just a personal example, I have friends in Houston, actually who are connected here in Austin as well, Damian Mandola, but the whole Mandola crew, which are also connected to the Ninfas crew. So it's like this whole, we jokingly called it like our Catholic mafia food people in Houston where I grew up. But the Mandolas were really good friends, but they were dealing with challenges and having the ICE raids happening in their restaurants all the time. So they were having immigration officials coming in and asking everyone to have their papers, or they would just load all the workers into the back of their trucks and then take them off, and they would lose their team for the day. And so they started going through a really concerted effort, one, to make sure that they were sort of tending to that fear and that like emotional need and support that their workers were having, but also sort of unpacking what do we need to do here in our workplace to support you and to make sure that we've got. And so they always had somebody on the floor basically who was prepared to deal with that. They had everybody's papers on file in their office. They had someone who was there who was bilingual, who could speak both Spanish and English in case there were, ICE officials that came to their workplace. And they were sort of constantly plugged into that need because they had so many Spanish-speaking employees and immigrant employees as part of their business. And that was just really critical. And I would say those kinds of things are just the subtle and not so subtle ways that, especially in the food industry, we have to kind of think about all the different types of people working for us. So one other thing that Lorraine and I talked about was the idea of implicit bias. And so I think one of the things, and I'm going to say this because it's a group of women, and I love working with groups of women because there's things I can say that I won't say when I'm training a group of men. But I was actually training an employee group who largely worked in security, like national security type work. And so it was a very male dominant field as it was. And these women were really struggling. And one of the things that I was trying to sort of focus on was first that we also have to look at, especially on the gender side of things, sort of where norms in industry came from. And those norms could apply to traditional brick and mortar businesses. But they also would have, I would say, apply to the food industry, because when you think about it, a lot of whether you're working in like a packaged goods business or whether you're running a restaurant, it was a male dominant space. It was largely a structure built by men in terms of how do we work and when do we work. And so a lot of women find ourselves trying to kind of retrofit traditional roles. And again, there's bias there. I mean, I know in my own family, there was not a woman running her own business in my mother pool, right, of women that were a model for me. I had to figure that out myself. And so that's part of just breaking those norms. But instead of being angry about it, what I try to do is understand, one, the importance of us, being role models and breaking those norms, but also that sometimes I have to educate my male counterparts on some of these things in a way that might feel a little painful. And frankly, men should be doing the same job to understand how women come at and how we problem solve. So the training I focused on was largely about, because I come from a medical family, so I focused on how our brains and our hormones work. I mean, basically how we function as human persons, and why there is absolutely a gender difference in how our brains are wired and how we have a hormonal response to stress and what de-stresses us. But that's like a whole other seminar we could do, and it's really fun and fascinating. I nerd out on that. But again, it came from this place of wanting to have, instead of being infuriated that I feel like my male counterpart is not hearing me when I'm trying to back up from the problem and problem solve and find a collaborative approach to the solution, I can go in with empathy and say, oh gosh, you know what's happening to this guy and why he's trying to spar with me right now? It's because I know that his male testosterone has gone through the roof and his body's trying to tell him, I've got to lower that down. And the way that he does that is fight or flight. And that's how the male brain is wired. Now, there's like no one universal truth to how every male and female operates. So like, hear me, I'm not trying to purport that, but there are some like fundamental differences that do generally sway the way we communicate that are different. But it's also why having women in industry is really effective and really important and really powerful, because we can problem solve in different ways that sometimes are better. And together it makes a much more productive industry, a productive workforce. And so that's sort of the point. But we're kind of right now in this clumsy period of trying to level all that out, both from a gender perspective, but then also now bringing in new norms of what a business owner looks like and how they operate and what their experiences do to inform how they run the business. So, I mean, but I want my key takeaway for you guys to be, one, just understand that implicit bias is real and it's also very normal, and that we all have it. And so it's not something to be scared of. It's something to just dig further in and understand. And the other is, in terms of looking at your own businesses, look broadly. You are very powerful in yourself as a little micro economy of yourself as your business, and you making choices about who you work with, who you source from, and who you involve in your business is as important as just sort of focusing internally, on who's on the floor or who's in your office, because you have reached beyond that. And those are places, I mean, even just here in Austin, where I think there's a lot of work we could be doing to sort of support other businesses and support other organizations. So I'm going to now just open up the floor. One, I know I'm like holding you from getting out into this gorgeous day, and so that's a hard spot to be in. But also just to, in chat, or feel free to just unmute yourself. If you guys have specific topics or questions you'd like for us to address, I'd be happy to do that.
And so y'all, you can see Marjorie now, the chat room, right?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so if somebody wants to talk out loud, you can, or if you want to drop it in the chat, you can. And so to kick us off, I just always like on implicit bias to offer this one example, which to me was like, when I got it in this one way, the whole point is I'm not even aware of all the implicit bias that I own, right? And that I operate with. But as I'm peeling back those layers, I sit on a lot of different grant review committees, and even in our own scholarship committee. And I was a big grammar buff in high school. And so when I'm reading those applications, it would drive me crazy if, there's no punctuation all over this, or they didn't even take the time to capitalize. Clearly that means they just don't even care about this and they did this in a hurry. And then I remember when somebody gave me that, like I had this first talk and was like, oh my goodness. So I just assumed that they had access to the same education, that they knew what an Oxford comma was or not. We don't need to go to Oxford commas, but I made a lot of assumptions there, like same access to education. What if there's a nonprofit, for instance, who's applying for something and it's a one-woman show who has 2 kids, she's a single parent, and she runs a whole nonprofit, makes a huge impact, and she's writing that application, at midnight when she's got her kids in bed and gets up and works the next day, versus a nonprofit who has 30 staff and pays a grant writer. And so anyway, I just realized by just thinking, what does this application look like? Clearly by how professional it looks, that shows intent, when instead that's not what it means at all, And so what are all the assumptions I made to get there? And once I peel those back, and now there's a lot of efforts to move towards more trust-based philanthropy, where you're really just trying to peel back the layers and say, what is the intent? Who is the person, and how are they getting stuff done? So that's just my own example of how I've been embarrassed to see ways that I've used that filter.
Well, thank you. That's really helpful. And I know that, so there's some nonprofits in town that are actually, one of the things they're thinking about doing, Kendall, we may be talking about the same one, they're scoring differently. So they're and so while grammar may matter, but if you are bringing certain diverse perspectives or different aspects to it, you get additional points for bringing that, let's just say, for example, diversity of the team working in that nonprofit, not just who you're serving. So they're trying to regulate some of those things in that way. So we had a question come in that is to everyone, so I'm going to read it out loud. But what are the clues to create a friendship on your team dealing with diversity of backgrounds? If I don't understand this right, feel free to correct me, but I think it's generally trying to get an understanding of how do you create friendship and connection with people who may be very different than you? I hope I have that right. If not, jump in. But I would say that, okay, yes, that's right. I think that one of the biggest things that we are guilty of as people, when I'm doing communication training, I sort of talk about it's to be an effective communicator, and to be effective communicator is also to be effective connector. It is a counterintuitive skill set sometimes, because we come to conversations generally bringing ourselves and sort of pushing it outward. So we come with our own agenda. This is what I want to accomplish. This is what I want to do. I'm going to tell you all about me. It's going to be amazing. And of course I love all of my stuff because it's me and I can talk about all of it. But really being an effective communicator is the opposite. It is first coming to your audience. So the person you're trying to connect with, focused on them. So focused on how can I better understand who they are, where they're coming from, so that I can then find ways to find the common ground, to figure out how are we connected. And one of the examples I use is talking about networking events. I don't know how many of you have been, I'm sure you have. I mean, you guys work in this space. You walk into a random room full of people. Let's say you're even like catering event and there's somebody standing there, and there's usually about 3 questions that first come out of people's mouth, which is, maybe why are you here? And somewhere in there, it might be, where are you from? What kind of food do you like? And all of these questions are really just about us searching for something to connect with that person on. Oh my gosh, you're from Houston too? That's so cool. Like, where'd you go to high school? Comes up, and all these random things that are basically our brains searching for common connection points. And I would say that what is the most common that we all have, and I think about this in like movies and stories that we read, and what draws us into movies and stories is that visual connection to familiar experiences. When something happens to a character, even if it's so far removed from our life, but is familiar, even if it's in grief or if it's in fear or if it's in hope. And so in people, we all have that, but part of that is a willingness to be vulnerable with people. It's a willingness to ask questions and seek to understand and learn about their lives. And so I would reckon that if you take the time, I can't believe I just said reckon, I was with my grandmother in East Texas. I would reckon if you start asking enough questions of the other person, that you will find things that you connect on, whether it is like your love of food, and whether it is somewhere interesting you've traveled. You know, I mean, whether it is someone who's never traveled, but maybe like me, grew up in a family with 5 kids that was like a chaos, and, you know, oh, I love chaos too. And then you find those things that tie you together. So just asking questions, and this is true, by the way, of your team members. So let me just also offer this. One of the things that we forget to do is honestly recognize that everyone we're working around and with is human. And Kendall, like your humanity that you shared with us, and just this, I mean, honestly, no, I mean that in like the most wonderful way. It's because like, I mean, I was about there with you, like bursting into tears, being like, I don't know how we've made it this far through the pandemic either, because it is such a universal experience, right? And so I would say that as much as you can bring to your employees and the people that you work with, even if you are the person in leadership, you know, that communication as much about what you don't know and what you're trying to figure out, so that they're on the journey with you, and communicating style things. Hey, you know what? I do not like text message. If you will communicate with me, you know, the afternoon is generally the best, and I do best via email, or I do best in person. But some of those connection points that become the most aggravating challenges we deal with in our workforce could be solved with that simple set of questions. How do you like to be worked with? How do you like to receive feedback? By the way, number one reason that the big 5 consulting companies don't retain women in their workforce is they don't like the way that men, their male bosses, give them feedback. And so there are just simple things like that to better understand, just as humans, how we work differently is amazing in terms of what it creates in connection.
Hi, Marjorie.
Yes. Hi.
Hey, it's good to see
Good to see you.
you. Question. I know the statement that was developed, which I think is amazing, by the way, took a lot. Can you guys talk about what does it mean to develop a statement like that? How much does it take? And what does a group of people sort of put into that to come up with a statement that defines their belief and understanding and expectations for their organization?
Are you thinking about for the DOMs, how you do that, how you develop that? I mean, I would say, are you thinking a broader mission statement, or are you thinking specific?
A broader statement. You know, when you come to the table and you say we're going to be intentional about crafting something like that, people see a statement and it looks so simple, and it's not, right?
Oh gosh, no. Yeah.
So Marjorie, we're putting up our equity statement that we just approved as a membership.
Oh, great. Okay.
And just sort of, what does it take to sort of come up with that, and what does that mean for a group or organization to come to that point to actually have a statement?
Well, so you have this. So help me understand what you're looking for.
Well, not looking for anything. I just know that it takes a lot to get there. Just what in your experience in dealing with companies and others, when they finally do come to a statement, what have they sort of done to get to that point?
Right. Oh gosh. Yeah. No, I mean, you're correct in that it does take a tremendous amount of work. And what I would sort of challenge you with is that in living those values that you've now put down on paper, what does that mean in an actionable steps? And so one of the most powerful things about that statement as well, I'm going to tell you, and this is where I'm pushing a lot of companies right now that I'm talking to, where they're having a disruption, or they're having a crisis, or they're having something that is interrupting, you know, kind of the norm, is to lean back on that statement. So how is your response to that moment, to that crisis, to maybe a new membership outreach or whatever it is you're doing connected to that? And so living in a constant place of repeating those messages and leaning on those messages as organizational values is really critical, because it creates that repetition, but it also creates that connection to the culture that you're trying to set. Because that's really what that's about, is you're setting the culture of your organization. And if you have just sort of a general mission statement, you might think of, how can we take the diversity and inclusion statement we came up with and marry those two together? And that's when it's really powerful, because then it's like the fabric of how the organization operates. And I had one more question I want to make sure. Does that answer what you were looking for, Joy?
Yeah, it does. And I think you hit it, was that, you know, you fundamentally changed the culture of the organization, even by the time you've gotten to the statement.
Yeah, that's right. Because you have to walk the talk, right? So another question, could you speak to the importance of valuing equity above and beyond simple inclusion? Right. So, I mean, this is sort of the like, this is walking the talk, right? And so,
And Marjorie, we actually haven't defined equity for anybody. We just jumped right in and said, here's our diversity, equity, and inclusion working group. And we've talked about diversity and inclusion, but we haven't really even talked equity. So.
Okay. Right. And I can forward you, I actually have a document that sort of defines all of those things as very different values. But what I would just, again, for the sake of time and this space, what I would focus on is, equity and equality. So I'll send out like the definitions. But it really is thinking about defining what is equitable, right? And what that means in terms of your organization. And that also includes in terms of your business. And so some of that may be looking at how am I coming up with compensation plans, and how does it take into account the whole totality of how someone, their experience base, but also what they're bringing to the organization. How do I think about investors and giving away actual equity, let's say, in your business? So, again, in the interest of time, because I know I'm getting a little bit of the like, hey, we're approaching the end, and I'm sure all of you have been on for a long time and would rather be toasting and drinking at this point. But why don't I do this? I will share with Lorena this definition framework, because I think as a next step for your organization, really understanding differences between inclusion, equity, and what was the other, and just diversity in general, those different terms would be really helpful for you to kind of unpack what that means. But I'll just say, looking at your membership and even just the different businesses on the who's included in the DOMS in terms of like their actual work. That's something to think about beyond just, you obviously are an affinity group, so you're women, but there's even more to think about that in current times too, right? In terms of what does that mean for you in terms of gender? So there's a lot to contend with in current times. Any other last questions? Again, just trying to honor your time.
Thank you so much, Marjorie.
Thank y'all for
appreciate you and
oh my gosh,
partying and being the beautiful soul that you are, and sharing with us today, and just all your work in the community as well, and giving up your Sunday afternoon on a great day.
This is my favorite thing to talk about. So, and I'm like a group of food women. Like, where else would I want to be? So now I'm just like, can I get invited to like other? I'll just be a sampler if y'all need one. So,
well, we're trying to be inclusive, so you can come to everything.
There you go.
Thank you, Marjorie.
Thanks, guys. Y'all have a good one. Bye.
All right, you guys. So